This is When Science Speaks, a new web series profiling innovative and interesting people working in science and technical fields, from academia to industry to the nonprofit world. We explore how to be a powerhouse advocate for science and your research, how to advance your career in meaningful ways that make you happy, and how to push back on the ongoing assault on science and other related issues of interest happening in the world.
Hey everyone, it's Mark Bayer, and you are tuned to When Science Speaks. This episode of the show is sponsored by Bayer Strategic Consulting in Washington, D.C., which helps scientists get funding, gain influence, and build strategic relationships with the stakeholders who matter most in their professional world. Reaching those goals often involves effective translation of complicated research into engaging, jargon-free communication that boils down complex topics to capture the attention of decision makers and general audiences. Interested in getting a free resource to help you do just that? Go to complexitymadeclear.com to get the 11 keys for translating complexity. That's complexitymadeclear.com to get your free infographic used by science communicators at major organizations to boil down, but not dumb down, complicated science and technical topics for key stakeholders. I am so pleased to welcome Michael Port to the show today. Michael is the author of 9 books, which have been translated into 29 languages. A few of them have become perennial bestsellers and made it onto such lists as the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, and USA Today. Some have won awards from 800 CEO Read and Amazon. After delivering thousands of paid speeches on the world's biggest stages, Michael and his wife, Amy, built Heroic Public Speaking HQ, which is a performance training center to develop and nurture the next generation of professional speakers, along with CEOs and founders, best-selling authors, business owners, and people leading important and advancing important causes. More information is available at heroicpublicspeaking.com. We'll have a link in the episode to that website and other resources Michael may mention, to his books, of course, in the show notes accompanying this episode. Michael Port, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much.
Professional transitions can be tricky to manage, and many listeners experience significant transitions, whether that's from grad student to PhD to postdoc, maybe from academia to industry. You've made several significant transitions in your own career journey. You earned your Master of Fine Arts at NYU. You had many roles on well-known films and TV series. You're now writing best-selling books, and you have your program speaking in front of audiences in the millions. You launched Heroic Public Speaking, as we talked about before with Amy. Thinking about your major professional transitions now, are there success factors that you can identify, perhaps in 2020 hindsight, that contributed to your ability to effectively navigate these transitions, that also could help listeners who are thinking about, or maybe even they're experiencing right now, major transitions in their own career journey?
Sure. Thank you for the question. It prompts a memory for me. In between acting and entrepreneurship, I spent about 5 years in the health and wellness industry, the fitness industry. Not as a trainer, but on the business side of the industry. And when I was leaving acting, there was a job opportunity at a very big health club company in New York. And I really wanted an interview. And I knew a woman who knew a woman who knew a woman who could get me the interview. It was one of those kinds of situations. Mm-hmm. And I was able to convince her to get me the interview. And when I got into the interview, the woman who was interviewing me was a little confused. She said, first of all, I'm not sure how you got here. Second, you have none of the requirements that we would expect a candidate for this position to have. You've never worked in this industry before. And I said, yes, you're 100%. But I think you're hiring the wrong people for this position. And I think you should hire me instead. And here's why. And I made my pitch. What I saw when I studied the organization is that they were promoting the most popular fitness instructors into managerial roles. And as a result, there was often a lot of disorganization in the departments that were run by these instructors who were wonderful people, incredibly skilled, but not managers, not operationally oriented, didn't necessarily think strategically about their role. And as a result, didn't really know what to do in that particular role. And so I said, listen, if you're worried that I haven't come from the fitness industry, I don't think that's actually something to worry about. I think the thing to worry about is, are you hiring people who are actually suited for this role? And I think I'm suited for this role because I'm very strategic, I'm operationally oriented. And and so I made my pitch and they gave me a chance. They gave me a shot. They put me in charge of a department at one of their small clubs. And within 5 months, they gave me another one. Within 6 months, I was running the whole division. It was a public company. And then 4 years later, I was recruited to go and open a very big club by another company. And I did that. And I think I did very well, in part because I didn't actually know how they did things. And so when I was analyzing the different processes that had been developed for different aspects of the operation, they didn't always make sense to me because they were often broken. Sometimes when people have been doing the same thing for a long time, they assume the way they've been doing it is the best way to do it. And because I came with a blank slate and really a beginner's mind, I was able to create new processes that were more effective for the current situation. And so anytime you're going into a new situation, you actually have an opportunity to bring a new perspective. And that new perspective can actually bring an enormous amount of value. Now, I was pretty bold, A, in trying to get the interview, and B, in the interview, telling the head of human resources that they were hiring the wrong people for this job. She very easily could have thrown me out of her office. Fortunately, I did it with enough grace and enough humility for her to listen and take a chance on me. But what did I have to lose? If she threw me out of the interview, it's not like I lost anything. It's not like I had the job and got fired from the job. And so I think sometimes when people go into new areas, or they transition, say, out of their PhD program into a corporation, or from the lab into a more communication focused role, they may sit back and wait to see how everybody else does it and figure they know how to do it, so I'll just do it the way they do it. But in fact, they may not add more value as a result. Instead, what we do is we analyze it, we take a beginner's mind, and we see, how would we approach it? And can we bring more value as a result?
Yeah, so important. Thank you for highlighting that, Michael. And I also want to mention again a couple of things that you said that are particularly relevant for listeners. One is that your personal story, your personal approach, you said you have a very strategic approach, operationally oriented attributes about yourself you emphasize. Sometimes that can be so important in an interview when, say, someone who's been doing research for 5, 6, 7 years as part of their PhD is now interviewing for a consulting firm that really works in a different industry. But it's the mindset and it's the skill set that you bring to it, even if the subject matter is not there initially. And then also you talked about how you researched the firm. That's a given, but a lot of people forget to do real thorough research. So you're able to point that out, that they've been promoting from their instructors, and maybe that's not exactly the right thing to do. So really relevant for the folks who are listening.
Mark, you mentioned, if I may, you mentioned give a candidate does research about the company and the position that they're interviewing for. And I'm sure you've experienced this as well. I've hired hundreds, if not thousands of people over my career. And I would say maybe 5% of them do any kind of legitimate research. I've literally been in interviews with people where they say, so what does your company do? And I've ended the interview after that.
Right.
I've just said, listen, there's no point in us continuing this conversation because I will not hire you no matter how well you present yourself in this interview. If you're asking me what this company does now, it's just not going to work. So that's actually often the norm, I think, for a lot of hiring managers, that people will come in relatively uninformed about either the organization or the position. And it's a bit disheartening, but I understand it. The job search can be frustrating. It can be anxiety provoking, overwhelming. And, and sometimes you get a little disappointed in the process. So you say, I don't want to put a lot of work into this because if I put a lot of work into this and I don't get it, it won't be worthwhile. But of course, the irony is if we don't put the work in, we're not going to get it and it won't be worthwhile.
You also mentioned the beginner's mindset, Michael, really approaching things from first principles, which is something that scientists are trained to do initially as well as they're approaching a project. So that's definitely a hopeful kind of attribute that can be applied to a completely different field and a completely different industry with great success if you do that with a thorough kind of a beginner's mindset, as you pointed. We talked about a little bit about communication just now. And if we weren't convinced of the need for clear, engaging science communication before the pandemic, the last 2 years have really illustrated how challenging and critical science communication can be, whether that's about COVID or climate change, or even more fundamentally, how the scientific inquiry actually operates. Don't know all the answers immediately and have to be ready to pivot as new information arises or is discovered. As a communications guru that you are, what weaknesses have you noticed about how information, say, about COVID has been communicated to the public? And then any tactics or strategies regarding the pandemic that were actually well crafted from your standpoint?
So let me address this first. One of the mistakes that many people make, especially scientists, is that they rely on the information to persuade people. And if you think about it just from a very foundational perspective, we are all very aware, I think, that even though we might have the right information, we don't behave in line with that information. For example, most people know that eating a Big Mac is not particularly good for you and eating a salad is very good for you. But many people will still eat the Big Mac anyway. And so if we assume that the information is going to persuade people, we're often going to run into brick walls. Because in order to change the way people think, we first need to change the way they feel. If we want to change what they do, we need to change how they think. And as I said, if we want to change how they think, we need to change how they feel. So it always works in that order. First, we try to change how people feel so we can try to change the way they think, so we can try to change what they do. And one of the biggest challenges we had during COVID, and we still have and will continue to have, and it seems like it is one of the most challenging problems we have in modern society today, is that once people feel a certain way about something like a vaccine, it's very hard to get them to think differently. And so what I saw were a lot of scientists really focusing on the science. And for some of us, that's very interesting. I was fascinated by the science throughout the process, but I didn't need to feel differently about vaccines. I already felt throughout the entire waiting process for the vaccine, really excited for a vaccine to come because I believe in the efficacy of vaccines when the best scientists in the world demonstrate that there is efficacy. I already have a tendency to feel that I can trust those people. My father's a doctor. I grew up around a lot of medical professionals and scientists, academics. But if you've not spent time around a medical professional, except when you go to visit a hospital or a doctor, which is usually a terrible experience, or when you were a kid and you took science class and you hated it, you might not feel the same way that, say, I did about science and the people who do such extraordinary research that saves lives. And so I think that if the scientists want to change how people act, they're going to need to change how they think. And if they want to change how they think, they're going to need to change how they feel. And I'll give you an example. So there was a gentleman who was doing a TED talk on the deleterious effects of climate change. And many people have been talking about the challenges that we face around climate change, but it doesn't always land. And so he needed to figure out a way to make it really easy for people to consume, in his particular case, how much oil is used in just the production of very everyday items. So, for example, speaking of a Big Mac, what he did was say, listen, I want to show you how much, oil, oil from the ground, not olive oil, but oil, crude oil is used to produce one Big Mac. So what he did is he took out a Big Mac and put it on a table and he opened it up so you could see the Big Mac. Then he took a pitcher filled with oil, black oil, and he put that on the table. Then he took out one glass and he put that on the table. He said, here, I'll show you how much oil it takes to make one Big Mac. He filled up the glass with oil, put the pitcher down, took a beat and said, nope, not that much. Took out a second glass, put it on the table, picked up the pitcher, filled up the glass, put down the pitcher, took a beat and said, nope, not that much. Took out another glass, picked up the pitcher, filled up the glass, put down the pitcher, took a beat, said, nope, not that much. Took out another glass, put it on the table, picked up the pitcher, filled it halfway, and then put down the pitcher and said, 3.5 glasses of oil. That's what it takes to make one Big Mac. I never forgot it. And I don't imagine anybody else who ever saw that forgot it. And so can you find ways of helping the audience see what you're talking about? Because most science is microscopic or macro, meaning climate change is a macro problem. And so it's so big, most people can't even comprehend, what it means. And then something like the science behind viruses and vaccine production, it's so tiny, it's so microscopic. If you're not a scientist, it's very hard to understand it or imagine it. But if you could make it really consumable by using some sort of example that will show them rather than tell them, then you're going to have a much more impactful result. You'll change how they feel, which means you'll change how they think, which means you can change what they do.
Yeah, that step and that sequence is so important because many folks feel after spending all this time, blood, sweat, and tears developing experiments and all the data that comes from that and the iteration and all that, the data should speak for itself, which of course it doesn't. And that sequencing with the sentiment and the feel is just so important. Michael, we touched upon this a little bit, but when you're thinking about complexity and there are all these different details that could potentially be included in a message, and it's hard to pare down and really decide what should be included and what should be dropped. In your books, you provide a clear, practical how-to on a methodology that you've come up with on how to become an authentic creative speaker. But a challenge that many listeners find as they're trying to communicate about their research is that the complexity of the information is above the understanding or the experience of non-experts, and trying to figure out, therefore, how to communicate it without using a lot of jargon and then deciding which details that get included, which details get left out. That can be quite a challenging exercise. And from your perspective, as someone who does this instinctively now and has come up with ways to teach this to folks, what are your thoughts on this? How to communicate complexity so even someone without any background on the topic can understand, enjoy, and remember the speech. I'm still thinking about the oil. Certainly the visuals are very helpful in making it relatable.
There aren't too many things that get easier to understand when they get more complex. So sometimes, and I've worked with many academics over the years from all of the big institutions, and very often when we start working with them, I feel that they can be a little bit lazy, which is ironic considering they're so accomplished.
Mhm.
But they're a little bit lazy about working to distill the data into an idea that people can process. Because data is just data. It's not ideas. And people don't really process data the way that a computer does or a scientist does. People consume ideas, feel a certain way about the idea, and then decide if they're going to adopt that idea as their own. And sometimes what happens when you spend a lot of time in the lab or around other academics, you may inadvertently get a little bit lazy and assume and be maybe even a little frustrated that you have to quote unquote dumb it down. That's what I hear. They're like, I don't want to dumb down my research. And my response is no, never. You should never dumb it down. But if you can't get this research across to the people who need to hear it, you're going to leave them dumber than they need to be. And so we have a responsibility if there is something that we understand and we need to get it out to particular groups or to the public to really work to distill the data down into one big idea that anybody can explain to anyone else so that it can spread. Because we saw this through COVID. And again, I'll go back to this feeling piece. There were a lot of supposed doctors, medical or PhDs, who were putting out false information. There was one, Dr. McCullough. Actually, I can't even really call him a doctor because I don't think he actually deserves that term, but he's he his website put out more misinformation during COVID than any other source. And but he did it all through the lens of firing people up, getting them to feel really angry about the situation, and then took advantage of that situation for commercial purposes. He made tens, if not hundreds of millions of dollars over this period of time as a result of getting people to feel the way that he wanted them to feel so that he could get them to think the way he wanted them to think. And so those of us who are on the side of actual science, we have a massive responsibility to work incredibly hard as you do on the research itself, on the communication of the research. And that does not happen in an hour or two. You don't put together a presentation, a 5-year or 10-year research project in an hour and expect people are going to be able to really grasp your big takeaway. There are a few fundamentals that exist in any great presentation. Number one, there's a big idea. Number two, there's a promise that if you adopt this big idea, it will lead you toward this end result. We also need to be able to demonstrate that we understand the way the world looks to the people that are in the room. Because if people don't think we understand their world view, even if what we're saying is something that they may say, that might be true, but you know what? You don't really understand me. I'm different. Because anytime you ask someone to change the way they think about something, you might be provoking them because they may have had a belief that has been a long held belief. They may have had a belief for 30, 40, 50 years. And here, you come along and in a few minutes say, no, that's wrong. This is the actual answer. And even if it makes sense to them, it's really confronting to realize that you've been wrongheaded for a long time. And once we are committed to a belief, we often don't want to let it go because it means not only have we been wrongheaded, but all the choices we've been making have been wrongheaded, and the people we've believed have been misleading us. There's a lot of really confronting. There's a lot of conflict that people go through when they start to consider changing their perspective. So if you don't demonstrate that you understand the way the world looks to them, it's too easy for them to say, nope, not, yeah, that's fine. That might be for someone else, but it's not for me because I'm different. So we need to have a big idea that's clear and spreadable, that delivers a promise that is appealing. We need to be able to demonstrate that we understand the way the world looks to the people in the room so that they start to drop their filter and say, okay, you get me. Okay, I'll open up a little bit to you. Then we need to be able to demonstrate the consequences of not adopting the big idea and pursuing the promise, as well as being able to demonstrate the rewards of adopting the big idea and pursuing the promise. And those rewards come in a number of different forms. Sometimes they're financial rewards. Sometimes they're emotional rewards. Sometimes they're physical rewards. And maybe even sometimes they're spiritual rewards. And I don't necessarily mean religious, but purposeful, connected to other people or the world around them. And if we haven't really considered all 5 of these foundational elements, we may be talking at people about data or simply information, and it hits them and just bounces off.
Yeah, so true. And you mentioned a couple of things I just want to underscore. Understanding where people are now, really that empathy, since we're talking about how to change the way people feel, empathy is a sentiment. It is a feeling. People feel empathic. It's addressing the right channel or broadcasting or communicating on the right channel rather than just the data channel. You said creates a lot of static if you try to do that. And by emphasizing belief as you did, underpinning that, of course, as you said, not just it's what I thought was true is no longer true, but beliefs are based on a lot of things like opinion, maybe values, the things that the community, their community values, things that really have nothing at all to do with facts.
And look, I'm sure you have a lot of psychologists who listen to your program, and they'll be the first to tell you that we all want to belong. And if we are part of a group that sees the world in a particular way, it's very hard to start changing the way we see the world, because that might mean that the group will no longer accept us. And we don't know if any other group will accept us because we've held these other beliefs for a long time. It's a very complicated matter. And I certainly don't think I have the answer to solving this on a global scale. That's for sure. But I think the people who we need at the forefront of this communication mission are the scientists. If we really could truly train all of the scientists to communicate effectively, then maybe we could get all of society moving in the right direction, or at least all would be a stretch, but at least the majority of society moving in the right direction. Because usually what we do is we wait until we get punched in the face to actually take any change. So we'll wait until climate change is so bad that there's famine throughout a third of the world and there's no water throughout a third of the world. Then we might say, well, I guess we should probably do something about this because yeah, there's no water and but unless we actually start hurting, generally we don't take action.
Yeah, that is an unfortunate part of the human condition. It's very true. Michael, I want to talk about your latest book, The Referable Speaker. It's a wonderful book. I'd love you to share with listeners what led you to write it, its major themes and takeaways, and also how you see it fitting in what I'll call the Port Pantheon of best-selling books.
The poor Pantheon of
Yeah.
best-selling books. That's a great line. I'm going to have to use that one.
Okay.
So The Referable Speaker is a book that I wrote with my dear friend and colleague, Andrew Davis. Andrew is a marvelous speaker, incredible human being. And we had been talking for many years about the challenges that we saw speakers, people who wanted to be professional speakers, faced when they were coming into the business, because we felt that much of what was being introduced to them was not only ineffective, but also just dead wrong. And so we came up with a question that we wanted to answer. I think every great book, great speech starts with a question. And then, like a scientist, you go on an investigation to try to answer that question. So the question we wanted to answer was, what's the formula for creating a sustainable speaking career? Now, you would think that would be an easy thing to answer, but we didn't see the answer out there, not in any cohesive or comprehensive form. We saw a lot of sort of tips and tricks that people could follow. And so we went on an investigation and we said, look, if we don't find the formula, we'll still publish what we find. But we, in fact, did find a formula. And it's very simple. It boils down to one thing: a speech that produces stage side leads. What are stage side leads? Stage side leads are invitations to speak at other events when people see you speak at a particular event. So they may come up to you right afterwards, say, hey, listen, this was incredible. I would love to bring this to we have an event on, January 22nd. What's your fee and are you available? Or they may call you up a week later, or maybe one of their assistants or associates will call you up, or they'll fill out a form in the middle of a speech because they're so excited and they send it to you. That's a stage side lead. Stage side leads close faster with fewer objections at higher fees than any other type of lead. In fact, there was a speakers bureau called Big Speak that did a study along with another speaker, friend of ours, a client of mine as well, named Jay Baer. And they wanted to know how meeting planners chose their speakers. So the top 3 ways that meeting planners chose their speakers are as follows. Number 1, they see the speaker somewhere themselves. Number 2, another meeting planner sees the speaker and tells their friend, the meeting planner, to hire that speaker. And number 3, someone inside the organization that is holding the event has seen the speaker and makes the request. And if the top 3 ways that a meeting planner is picking their speakers is by referral, what makes someone refer? It has to be the speech, the product, because when you're not famous, they are going to pick the speech first and then you. When you're very famous, it's the other way around. If it's Malcolm Gladwell, they say, Mr. Gladwell, we have an event on January 22nd. Are you available and what's your fee? And he says, oh, I am available. My fee is $18 million. And they say, oh, that's great. It's much less than we thought it would be. We'd love to sign a contract. But for the rest of us, that aren't worldly famous, we need to deliver a product that cannot be denied. What many experts do is rely on their bona fides. They say, listen, I'm a professor at Harvard. That should be enough. I'm a lead scientist at J&J. That should be enough. I'm the chief technical officer from Tesla. That should be enough. But in reality, on the speaking circuit, it's not. The people that work consistently, meaning they can sustain a career, are the people whose speeches produce more speeches. And so what we discovered is that you can leverage the power of compounding gigs. Because if you do one speech and you get 4 leads and 2 of those become bookings, then you do 2 more, you get 4 more leads each time. 4 of those become bookings, assuming you're booking at about 50% of the leads that come in, so on and so forth. And within a short period of time, that one speech you did produced 25 or 50 more speeches. It's not the marketing that produces the speeches, it's the speech that produces the speeches. So that's what we focused on. And the book is really written for people who are speaking a lot, who want to speak a lot, or are professionals who want to increase their fees. And certainly a lot of academics, they get a little bit, at some point, they get a little frustrated with academia and they start to think, could I go out on the road? Could I write books? Could I speak instead? Could I reach more people that way than through my position here at the institution? And as a result, try to make that transition. And if they just rely on their past credentials, it's a really tough row to hoe. People don't care that much about what you did. That they really care about what you're able to do for an audience in the moment.
So true. And when you're talking about the meeting planner seeing you or telling colleagues, it really relates to the previous conversation that we just had about seeing is believing, right? So that seeing that person, I have certain beliefs as a result, certain feelings, and then if those are positive, then you can end up getting a stage side lead perhaps.
Mhm.
I want to just, as we wrap up, Michael, talk about the writing and publishing aspect of these best-selling books. Obviously, they don't just appear out of nowhere. Our listeners often are writing and publishing scientific findings or learnings about their research. And that process, as from a firsthand perspective, is a challenge. It can be daunting at times. As an author of now 9 best-selling books, what have you learned about the writing process and maybe things that you wish you'd known at the beginning or that would be useful to other writers aiming to get their research published?
So my writing style is probably very different than the writing style of most of your listeners.
Mhm.
When I started writing for readers, meaning outside of school, when I started writing for readers, it didn't work very well. Meaning people weren't that excited with what I was putting out. I started putting out in the early 2000s. I started putting out articles and wrote a blog, and I couldn't really figure out. I said, well, the information in here is really good. I don't understand why they're not picking up on it. And then one day I was having a conversation with my dad, and right after I got off the phone with him, I started writing, and I had an epiphany. I realized I was trying to write the way my father would write, who is an academic.
Hmm.
And I'm not an academic. And when he sends me an email, I ask him one question, I'll get 18 paragraphs back. I have to leave it. I have to dedicate 2-hour block each week just to read the emails that he sends me. And so what I started practicing is writing the way that I spoke. And as a result, my writing got a lot better. I stopped worrying about trying to sound good, trying to sound smart. And as a result, people were more interested in reading what I had to write or had to say. And then, of course, I just got better at it over time. One of the things that I often recommend academics do, unless they already know for a fact, because they have been able to prove it, that their writing style is really consumable for the kind of audience they're writing for, meaning if you're writing for academics, feel free to write like an academic. Maybe that's the kind of writing they like to read. Although I'm not so sure about that either. Most academics don't even love to read academic papers. But if you want to try to take your research and bring it out to non-academics, to people who are not used to reading academic papers, it's often a very good idea, and it's what I suggest my clients do, is to collaborate with a writer who is a very skilled writer for the kind of people you're trying to reach, so that you write something that's a lot more consumable. Richard Thaler has done this with most of his books. Even some of his books are sometimes a little bit heady, but it's one of the reasons he's been so effective. And then there are other, Dan Ariely's really does a great job of writing for the lay audience. I don't know if he works with somebody else who helps him, or he has worked on writing the general audience or the general public for many years and does a great job of it. But there's no shame in collaborating with somebody else. One of the things I've found sometimes with the academics is because they come from an environment where you always have to be the smartest person in the room and you're being judged on what you're able to do, sometimes they think, oh, I've got to do everything myself, or else people aren't going to take me seriously. They're not going to think I'm as capable as I am. I took the opposite approach. I was really clear early on where my gaps were. And I try to fill those gaps by collaborating with people who had the skills that I didn't, had the abilities that I didn't. And that helped me progress more quickly. So if you are trying to move from the academic world into the lay world to reach the lay people like me, then it may be a good idea to collaborate with someone on your book project so that you can write something that's much more consumable and really changes the way people feel, changes the way they think, and ultimately changes what they do.
Michael, thank you so much for this conversation and for providing such specific and actionable advice for folks that they can apply and really start to see a difference.
Thank you. It's my pleasure. I was happy to spend some time with you, Mark. You're delightful.
Same here. Feelings are mutual. And listeners, thank you for being here on this episode of When Science Speaks. And I hope you'll be back next time for the next episode of When Science Speaks.
Thanks for listening. Be sure to click subscribe. Check us out on the web at whensciencespeaks.com, and we'll see you next time.